They called her the Cripple on the night she was given away, and every voice in the great hall laughed. They would not laugh at the close, not one of them. The king would see to that. Though on the night of the dying moon in the year 1041, he did not yet know her name. If you have ever watched a woman be handed over like a treaty clause, offered up in a cold hall to people who had already decided she was worth nothing, then you already understand what happened in Vain Keep that winter. Stay with this story. What comes after the laughter is the part that matters. The night of the dying moon fell on the third day of deepest winter, when the pack world marked its dead and settled its political debts in the same breath. The calendar had always been convenient that way for men like Counselor Drevin. A night for grief and obligation made a fine cover for the smaller cruelties he preferred to conduct with witnesses present. Jasper Stormborn stood at the entrance of the great hall and did not look like anyone's idea of a ward. She was 22 years old, 5 winters past the fire that had taken her family's cottage, and most of the feeling in her left hand, and she had spent those years learning to mix wound salves and grind medicinal bark under the instruction of Elder Marin, the pack's oldest healer. Her clothes were clean. That was the best that could be said for them. The keep's stone floor was cold enough to feel through the soles of her boots, and the hall held perhaps 300 wolves arranged by rank, the highest born nearest the dais, the lowest pressed against the back walls where the brazier heat did not reach. She had not been told what the treaty required of her, exactly. Elder Marin had told her only to stand straight and say nothing unless a question was directed at her, and to remember that the hall would have seen worse before she arrived. The council table sat to the left of the dais, and Draven occupied its center chair. He was a narrow man with the kind of face that calculated before it felt anything. Pale-haired, dry-handed, wearing his authority the way some men wore fine wool, not because it kept them warm, but because it announced a price. He watched Jasper cross the hall with the specific attention of someone who had already decided what to do, and was merely confirming that the obstacle was as small as expected. The Alpha King was on the dais, and he was not what she had prepared for. She had heard what was said of Aldrich Vane in the lower districts, in the healer's workroom, in the narrow corridors between servant quarters where gossip moved faster than any decree. She had heard that he was cruel by nature and fair only when watched. She had heard that his first ceremonial bond had ended in catastrophe, that the severance had left something wrong in him, a wound that did not close. She had heard that he had not smiled in 3 years, that the pack's surviving elders had stopped requesting audiences, that the council spoke for him now in most matters because he was, as Draven's people phrased it, too unwell to govern reliably. What she had not prepared for was the stillness of him. He sat in the carved chair at the dais's center with his hands flat on the armrests and his eyes on the middle distance, and the air in the hall organized itself around him the way iron filings organize around a lodestone, not drawn toward warmth, but toward gravity. There was a line of old silver scarring along his jaw, faint and healed over, but permanent, and he held himself with the kind of careful economy that suggested the act of sitting upright cost him something he was not willing to admit. He was maybe 30. He looked older and younger than that at the same time, younger in the bone structure, older in the eyes. She made herself look away before he could read the looking. Draven stood. The hall stilled. The ward of the Stormborn Treaty, presented under the night of the dying moon, he announced, and there was nothing warm in his voice, no ceremony beyond the minimum required to make the thing legally witnessed. Let it be noted that the pack receives her in settlement of the debt her family contracted and failed to honor before their house fell. He paused. A very short pause, calibrated. She comes with little to recommend her. Her line is extinguished. Her training is incomplete. And her left hand, he said, is as you can see. She had worn no glove. Elder Marin had told her not to, and she had trusted that instruction without fully understanding it. Now she understood. Marin had known they would look for something to mock, and had decided it was better to give them the truth plainly than to offer a concealment they could strip away later for greater theater. The laughter started at the council table and moved outward through the hall like a wave finding its level. Not every voice joined it, but enough did. "The cripple," someone said, and others repeated it, and it became the word that defined the night. She did not flinch. She held her scarred hand at her side, fingers curled against her palm, the way they always fell when she was not actively making them straighten, and she kept her eyes on the far wall and breathed. On the dais, Aldrich did not laugh. She noticed that. She filed it away as meaningless, because powerful men often stayed silent during others' cruelty not from decency, but from disinterest, and she was not ready to assign him anything better than that. Draven sat. The ritual moved on to its other business. Jasper was given a sleeping room near the lower kitchens and a designation as general ward labor, and the night of the dying moon closed around the keep with the cold indifference it always had. She had been inside Vane Keep for 11 days when the senior healers refused the king. The news traveled the lower corridors in fragments. Aldrich's severance wound, the old injury from the failed bond rite 3 years prior, had reopened. Not fully, not visibly, but the silver trace corruption that Draven's council had assured the pack was resolved had never actually resolved, and it had found new depth. The 3 pack healers of senior rank, Corvin and the 2 Gren brothers, declared the case beyond their competence and declined to treat it. The real reason was simpler, and Jasper heard it from the kitchen boy, who had overheard 2 servants near the infirmary door. The wound was silver-laced at its core, and touching silver-laced flesh without the right preparation could carry the poison into the healer's own blood. No one withstanding wanted to risk it. Elder Marin came to find Jasper in the storage room, where she had been sorting dried herbs. The old healer moved slowly but arrived directly, without the softening preamble that meant she was going to ask something manageable. "The king's wound needs tending," Marin said. "No one senior will go near it." Jasper set down the bundle of dried fennel. "You're asking me. I'm telling you that no one else will do it." Marin placed her scarred hand on the work table, not a gesture of comfort, just steadying herself. "You know the counter preparation. I taught you the full protocol 2 years ago, before the fire. You are the only one in this keep with that specific training, and the king will die within a fortnight if the wound's silver thread is not drawn out by someone who knows the binding procedure." Jasper looked at her own left hand, the one Draven had made the hall laugh at 11 days prior. "I can manage the binding with my right hand leading," she said. "I know you can," Marin said. "That is why I am here." The king's chamber was at the keep's highest inhabited floor. Past 2 guards who looked at Jasper with the careful blankness of men who had been told to let her through but did not like the order. The room was large and cold, a fire burning in the hearth without quite winning against the stone, the light landing in long, irregular patches across the floor. Aldrich was in the bed near the window, which was a choice that struck her as deliberate, as if he had positioned himself where the last outside air could reach him. He was awake. He watched her come in with the same quality of stillness she had noted from the dais, and said nothing until she had set her satchel on the side table and unrolled her preparation kit. "You are the ward," he said. "Yes, my lord." "The healers sent the ward." "The healers declined," she said, with enough exactness that it was neither an accusation nor an apology. "I trained under Elder Marin. I know the silver binding protocol." A pause. Then, "Your hand." "My right hand leads. The left assists where it can." She met his eyes because looking away would have been its own admission. "I have done this before on practice wounds. Not on a severity like yours, but the method does not change with depth, only the time." He said nothing else. He pushed back the linen at his shoulder and she saw the wound. It was worse than she had expected, and she had expected bad. The silver trace had worked its way along the old severance scar in threads the color of tarnished iron, branching under the skin in a pattern she recognized from Marin's teaching diagrams. 3 years of incomplete healing, closed over at the surface and corrupting beneath. Whatever rite had made the original bond had left a seal in the tissue, and someone had ensured that seal was never properly dissolved. Her hands were steady. She had always been able to make her hands steady when the work required it. "This is going to be cold first," she said, "and then it will burn. Tell me if it stops burning, because if it goes numb, that means the silver trace has moved and I need to adjust." He did not respond to that as an instruction requiring acknowledgement. He simply turned his face toward the window. She registered that as acceptance, and began. The first night, she worked for 3 hours and drew out perhaps a third of the visible silver thread. She applied the binding poultice she had mixed in the storage room that afternoon, wrapped the wound in treated linen, and gathered her kit. He had not made a sound the entire time. At the door she paused, because something had happened during the work that she was not prepared to examine in his presence. When her right hand had first made contact with the skin at the wound's edge, something had jolted through her palm and up her wrist, a spark or a current. Nothing metaphorical, a physical event, as if she had touched the handle of a knife left near a flame. She had kept her face still. She had filed it under the wound's ambient fever, under the silver's residual charge, under any explanation that did not require her to consider the alternative. The alternative was not something she was willing to consider. She came back the second night and the third. On the fourth night, one of the lower guards said something to her in the corridor, something short and dismissive about her hand, about her general fitness for work near the king, about cripples playing at healers. She heard it and kept walking. 2 minutes later, when she entered the king's chamber, Aldrich looked past her toward the corridor and said, in a voice that carried without being raised, "Reassign the corridor guard on this floor. Rotation violated protocol." She knew the guard had not violated any rotation. She knew exactly what the reassignment meant. She said nothing. She set her satchel on the side table and unpacked her materials, and told herself it was protocol. The audience, if there had been one, would have known otherwise. On the fifth night he asked her name. She told him. He repeated it once, quietly, as if setting it in a place it would not be lost. She kept her eyes on her work and did not address what the repetition meant, because she had been in the keep long enough to understand that hope was an expensive currency, and she had very little left. The sixth night was the one that mattered. She arrived to find the wound significantly cleaner, the silver threading reduced to a faint residual trace that another night's treatment would resolve entirely. She had been grinding the final compound, the deep binding agent that would seal the cleared tissue and prevent recurrence, for 2 nights. And the work had been the hardest of all, because the compound's base was crystallized ironwood bark, dense as stone, and grinding it required sustained pressure that her left hand could manage only in short intervals before the pain became too sharp to work through. She had shifted the work entirely to her right hand by the third hour of grinding, which was slower, and the skin at her palm had gone from ache to rawness to the specific thin heat of broken skin by the time the compound was ready. She had wrapped her right palm before coming to his chamber. The wrapping was thin and already showing a faint rust-colored stain before she arrived. She worked with her usual economy. Aldrich watched the ceiling and breathed. When she applied the final compound and felt the silver thread signature in the tissue begin to dissolve under it, the relief in the room was not hers alone. She watched his breath change, watched the particular tightness around his eyes ease by a degree that she would not have noticed if she had not spent 6 nights memorizing what tension looked like on a face that refused to show it. "It will hold," she said. "The final layer will need 2 more days to set fully, but the silver is out." She began packing her kit. The fire had burned lower while she worked, and the room was colder than it had been when she arrived, and she was tired in the specific way that meant her left hand was going to be useless for anything delicate in the morning. "Jasper." She stopped. "Your hand," he said. She looked at her right palm. The wrapping had bled through more than she had realized. A palm-sized stain, rust going red at the edges. "It is fine," she said. "The compound ground rough. It will heal." He said nothing immediately. She heard something in the silence that she could not name and was not going to try. "Be careful in the lower corridors," he said. The words were flat. The tone was flat. It could have been a king's general safety instruction to any ward passing through his hall at night. "The east passage near the kitchens is poorly lit." She said goodnight and left. She walked the east passage and noted that it had been fitted with 2 additional torch brackets since the night before, the pitch still fresh on the iron. She thought about that for a long time in her small room near the kitchens, and she was still thinking about it when she heard the voices. The wall between her room and the adjoining store chamber was old and imperfectly mortared in one section near the floor, and sound carried through it in the specific way that stone amplifies what it does not absorb. She had learned the wall's property on her first night in the keep. She had not used the knowledge deliberately. She used it now. Draven's voice was recognizable, dry and flat and precise. He was speaking to at least 2 others, and from the titles exchanged, she understood these were the 3 council members who sat closest to him. His plan was not complicated. It relied on a fact she had not considered: that completing the cure would demonstrate her competence in a context that made Draven's authority uncomfortable. The king recovering his health meant the king recovering his capacity to govern without the council's guidance, and Draven had spent 3 years building a structure that depended on Aldrich's incapacity. She had been solving one problem without understanding she was dismantling another. The solution Draven had reached was straightforward. She would be arrested before dawn on the charge of poisoning the king, the claim being that the compound she had applied was itself contaminated, a deliberately introduced corruption rather than a cure. The charge would be made before the assembly as an emergency matter of pack safety. The cure would be attributed to malice. She would be executed before the compound finished setting, and before Aldrich was strong enough to walk to the hall to contest it. 3 council members were complicit. Draven needed only their voices to constitute a quorum for an emergency measure. She sat on the floor with her back against the cold wall and let the information settle. She did not have until dawn in any practical sense. She had until the compound finished setting, which she had told the king would take 2 days, but she had been conservative with that estimate because the ironwood base in the final layer made the process uncertain. It could set fully in 1 day. It might set in less if the wound's own recovery heat was sufficient, which, given how quickly his condition had improved tonight, was possible. If the compound set and Aldrich stood, she had a witness who knew the cure was real. If she was arrested and executed before he could stand, there was no witness who would be believed over Draven's quorum. She got up. She went to her satchel and checked what remained of the ironwood compound. There was enough for a second application, a concentrated one, that would accelerate the setting beyond what a single standard treatment could achieve. She had not done this on a wound of this severity before. The standard protocol cautioned against acceleration because it increased the heat load on healing tissue. She weighed the caution against the alternative, and the alternative was concrete and specific, and had a timeline. She went back to his chamber before the first hour of the new day had finished. The guard at the door was the reassigned one, a woman named Brint, who had been on this floor for the past 3 nights, without the contempt her predecessor had shown. Jasper said she had forgotten her calibration tool and needed to check one reading. Brint let her through. Aldrich was not asleep. He turned his head as she entered, and she saw the question in the set of his shoulders before he could form it into words. "I am going to be arrested at dawn," she said, because there was not enough time to approach this indirectly. "Draven has 3 council votes and an emergency measure and a charge of poisoning. I heard him an hour ago. She set the satchel on the table. The compound will set fully in time if I apply an accelerant layer tonight. Your tissue is strong enough to manage the heat. I would not do it otherwise. A long pause. He was watching her in the dim room with an expression she had spent 6 nights learning to read, and what it said to her now was that nothing she had told him surprised him about Draven. If you are arrested before I can stand, he said, the compound will still have set. You cannot walk to the hall in the time it will take them to process an emergency quorum, my lord. How long for the accelerant layer? 4 hours. If the tissue responds as I expect, you will have full function returned in 6. He held out his shoulder, the same gesture as the first night, pushing back the linen. The wound was already visibly improved from the earlier treatment. She mixed the accelerant compound in the small bowl she carried, applied it over the treated tissue with her right hand leading and her left steadying the bowl, and worked through the 4 hours with the fire burning lower and lower behind her. Her right palm reopened somewhere around the 3rd hour. She did not stop. She shifted the work angle and continued. When she was done, the wound's silver trace was gone. She could not feel any residual corruption in the tissue at all, not through the compound surface, not through the faint pressure reading her hand could give her. Whatever Draven's witches had built into the old severance scar, it was gone. She had been back in her room for less than an hour when the guards came. There were 4 of them, and they named the charge formally in the corridor outside her door, loudly enough that 2 kitchen workers sleeping nearby would hear it. She noticed that. It was designed to be heard. Draven understood the value of witnesses even before the official assembly, understood that the story moving through the lower corridors before the official proceeding would pre-shape what the assembly understood they were voting on. She did not resist. She had her satchel. She had her healer's documentation roll, which she had placed in it before lying down, and she had the single sealed packet that Elder Marin had given her on her 2nd day in the keep. Pressed into her hand without explanation, along with a quiet instruction to carry it always and to present it only if she had no other option. The assembly hall in Vane Keep held roughly the same crowd as the night of the dying moon had. Different bodies in some places, the same arrangement of rank. The high-born nearest the dais and the low-ranked pressed toward the back where Senna stood, her face white, her hands twisted together, watching from the wall. Draven stood at the council table. The 3 supporting members sat beside him. The charge was read in formal pack language. Deliberate introduction of a toxic compound into the king's wound under the cover of a healing roll, constituting attempted regicide, punishable by immediate execution before the full assembly as a matter of pack law. Jasper stood at the floor's center and let the charge be read in its entirety. She had one option before the execution order was formalized. Pack law, the older version that predated Draven's recent council revisions, permitted the accused to name a witness to the act's intent. Not to prove innocence, only to name a witness. Draven had revised the law 2 years ago to limit the scope of testimony, but he had not fully closed the older provision because it was embedded in the founding charter and removing it would have required a full assembly vote he had not wanted to call. She knew this because Elder Marin had told her, 3 days after her arrival in the storage room, in a tone that had sounded like general healer's education and now sounded like something considerably more deliberate. I name Elder Marin as witness to the work and the compound's composition, Jasper said, into the assembled silence. Draven's expression did not change, but his posture did. A degree of recalibration she felt more than saw. He had not expected the old provision to be invoked, because no one in the keep's lower ranks was supposed to know it existed. Marin came forward from the assembly's left side where she had been standing, and Jasper understood that the old healer had already been in the hall before the proceeding began. Marin's testimony was brief and exact. The compound's components were named, their properties described, their preparation documented in the healer's roll that Marin had signed as supervising elder on the night it was mixed. The documentation roll Jasper carried in her satchel was the original. Marin produced the counter copy from her own satchel, signed and dated, the two documents matching in every detail. Then Marin did something Jasper had not been told to expect. She placed on the dais the small sealed packet she had kept a copy of, the one matching the packet she had given Jasper to carry, and she said, in a voice that carried to every wall, "The ward's lineage is a matter of pack record, sealed by the registrar in the year 1019 and held under Marin's house since the Stormborn fire was ruled a set fire, not an accident. The ward carries the registrar's mark beneath the scar on her left hand. She is Stormborn of the third bloodline, entitled to standing before this assembly." The mark was there. Jasper had not known what it was. The old registrar's seal, pressed into the skin below her scar at infancy, barely visible under the fire-changed tissue, was the kind of mark that could only be made in the first year of life as a lineage record. She had thought it was scarring. It was not. Draven's posture changed again. Before he could speak, the doors at the hall's far end moved. The sound they made was not dramatic. It was the sound of a door opened by a man who did not require drama, a controlled push that covered the full width of the frame and let in the cold morning air. The torches in the passage behind bent sideways in the draft. Aldrich Vane walked into the hall. He was not moving at full strength. Anyone watching could see that. The careful placement of each step said that the compound was set, but the tissue was still knitting. He moved through the assembly without looking at it, and the assembly divided and stepped back. Not because he signaled them to, but because the quality of his presence made the idea of remaining in his path feel inadvisable. He had dressed without armor. He was wearing the crown, the plain iron circlet of the vein line, and his scarred jaw was set, and his eyes were on Draven. Draven stood. "My lord, you are not well enough to attend. The healers have said, your condition requires rest, and the council has already convened on this matter in the interest of pack safety. The accused ward has endangered your life, and the assembly has been called to witness the appropriate. My lord, the assembly. The charter requires a quorum of the council. The vote is already formally under. The matter is, the execution order requires only the council's voice. The charter does not require your, my lord, the charter clearly, my lord." He was still speaking when Aldrich reached the dais and turned to face the hall. The silence that followed was not the silence of the night of the dying moon, full of laughter waiting to happen. This silence had a different weight. It was the silence of an assembly that understood, collectively and suddenly, that it had been reading the wrong document for 3 years. "Councillor Draven," Aldrich said, "arranged the failure of my severance rites healing 3 years ago. He left the silver trace in my wound because a king who cannot stand cannot govern, and a king who cannot govern requires a council to speak for him, and a council that speaks for the king holds the throne in all practical terms without bearing its cost." The hall did not move. "I have known this since the second winter," Aldrich said. "I did not have proof I could place before the founding charter's standard. I have it now." He looked at the 3 complicit council members in sequence. Each one, under that look, found something to study in the floor. The ward's healer's roll and the countercopy held by Elder Marin constitute a signed record that the compound applied was curative and was overseen and documented before application. Draven's poisoning charge requires the compound to have been introduced without documentation and without witness. The documentation exists, the witness is present. The charge is fraudulent and constitutes an abuse of the emergency measure provision for the purpose of eliminating testimony inconvenient to the council. Draven's voice, when it came, was stripped of its usual calibration. "The ward's lineage is contested. Her standing is? The registrar's mark has not been formally verified by the current. The assembly cannot be asked to accept, my lord. This is not the proper procedure. The charter requires. It requires. This is not." This is not how the charter is applied, my lord. Present the seal, Aldrich said. Not to Draven, but to Marin. Marin brought the sealed packet to the dais. Aldrich broke the outer seal himself and read it, which was a formality because both of them already knew what it said. Then he held it so that the closest members of the assembly could see the registrar's mark and the date. 1019, the year Jasper had been born, the year the seal had been pressed. The Stormborn third line, he said to the hall, not extinguished, registered and concealed. The fire that destroyed the family's house was set. He folded the document, by order of this council. The three complicit members stood simultaneously, as if they had discussed this moment and decided movement was preferable to stillness. The movement did not help them. The assembly was between them and every door, and the assembly did not move to make a path. What happened to Draven was not long in coming. He had built his authority on one load-bearing structure, the false bond seal he had maintained in Aldrich's wound, the ceremonial residue of the failed rite that his witches had kept alive as a suppressive mechanism, a thread of compulsion threaded through the silver corruption that kept Aldrich's capacity dampened. When the compound dissolved the silver trace, it dissolved the seal's physical anchor. The seal itself had been a constructed thing, not a natural bond, not a true mate recognition, and a constructed thing deprived of its anchor does not dissolve quietly. It reverses. The three council members who had maintained the seal alongside Draven felt it break at the same moment he did. Two of them went to their knees on the stone floor with a sound like a door slamming in a high wind. The third had enough presence to remain standing, but the color left his face entirely. Draven stood for 4 seconds after the seal broke. He stood the way a man stands when his balance is entirely internal, and the internal has just failed him. Then he fell, and he did not rise, and the hall was very still around the place where he lay. Pack law recorded cause of death in such cases as bond severance feedback, which was accurate, and also did not require anyone to explain what the bond had been built from or what it had been designed to do. It was a known risk of constructing false ceremonial seals, which was also an illegal act, which meant the 3 surviving council members were already under arrest before the hall had finished processing what it had witnessed. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 20 seconds, which is a long time in a room containing 300 people. Aldrich stood on the dais. He turned to look at Jasper, who was still standing at the hall's center, where the guards had left her when the morning's events had overtaken their instructions. She was still holding her satchel. Her right palm's wrapping had bled through again during the walk from her room to the hall, and she had not had time to address it. He came down from the dais. He crossed the floor at the same deliberate pace he had entered with, unhurried, the assembly parting again in that same wordless response to his direction. He stopped before her. He was close enough that she could have put her hand on the compound-treated wound if she had reached out. He took the satchel from her hand, gently, and set it at his feet. Then he took her right hand, the wrapped one, and turned the palm upward. He looked at the blood-stained linen without expression, and then he looked at her face. And what she read there was not gratitude, which she had expected, and was not command, which she had also expected, but something she had no prepared category for, because no one had ever aimed it at her before. The hall was watching. 300 wolves, arranged by rank. The highborn nearest the dais. The low-ranked pressed toward the back walls where the brazier heat did not reach. The same arrangement as the night of the dying moon. Every witness who had been present when Draven had named her the Cripple, and the hall had laughed. Aldrich reached up and lifted the iron circlet from his own head. She heard the intake of breath from the assembly, one collective sound, as if the hall had one set of lungs. He set the crown on her brow. It was not a delicate placement, not tentative, not a gesture that could be read as anything other than what it was. The iron settled against her hair, cool and definite, and he stepped back one pace so the hall could see it. "The ward Jasper Stormborn," he said in the voice that assumed compliance, "is recognized before this assembly as Luna Queen of the Vane Pack, of the third bloodline, standing restored under the founding charter's provision for lineage recovery. Her standing is permanent. Her person is mine to guard. Any voice in this hall that calls her otherwise will answer to me directly." He did not say it as a threat exactly. He said it the way a man states a fact about weather or stone, something the world already knows and does not need debating. The assembly knelt. Not in a coordinated wave, but one by one, starting with those nearest the dais and moving outward through the ranks toward the back walls, a slow accumulation that became total. The high-born first, because they understood fastest what had shifted and who held the consequence for being slow. The lower-ranked next, because they had less to perform and more to feel. Senna knelt near the back wall and was crying, which was not something she would have admitted to in ordinary circumstances. She did not bother hiding it. Elder Marin knelt at the hall's left side, her old joints lowering her carefully to the stone. She did not look up at Jasper. She looked at the floor in the formal posture of pack deference, and the line of her back was straight, and there was something in the deliberateness of the gesture that said she had waited a long time to make it. The coda to all of this arrived quietly, the way most true endings do, without the weight of ceremony around them. 2 days later, in the healer's workroom where Jasper had gone to resupply her kit, Marin came in and sat on the stool near the mortar bench without being asked. She watched Jasper sort dried materials for a while, then said, "Your mother brought you to me the night before the fire. She knew what was coming." A pause. "The sealed packet was what she left with me. She asked me to wait until you had a reason to use it." Jasper set down the dried bark she was holding. She thought about this for a long time without speaking, which was something Marin had always been patient with. "She knew about Draven," Jasper said. "She knew about what families like his do to families like yours," Marin said. She was very practical about it. Jasper nodded once. She picked up the bark again and continued sorting. Later that evening, in the king's chamber, Aldrich was sitting near the window where the last outside air could reach him. He was not in the bed. The wound's tissue had healed cleanly past the point of requiring that level of management, and he moved without the earlier careful economy, without the cost that every gesture had shown in the nights she had tended him. She had come to check the final layer's integration, which was the healer's reason. He had known she was coming and had not mentioned any alternative reason, and neither had she. She examined the wound site with her usual economy. The compound had integrated fully. The silver trace was entirely gone. The scar it left behind was clean, a pale line following the old severance mark, nothing alive in the tissue below it. "It's finished," she said. "Yes," he said. She began wrapping her kit. Her right palm was healed enough to work without the linen by now, a thin new skin over the rawness, still pink. Her left hand had not improved, but had also not worsened, which was its usual accommodation with her. He reached out and covered her left hand with his palm over her scarred knuckles, not pressing, just resting. The jolt she had felt on the first night was quieter now, or she had simply stopped pretending it was the wound's fever, and either way, she did not pull away. Outside the window, the winter was still deep. The courtyard below held the usual frost-hardened mud, the breath of the guards fogging in the torchlight, the black pine forest pressing the keep's walls from 3 sides. The night of the dying moon was weeks behind them now, and what it had marked was not what Draven had intended to mark with it. The crown was on its stand near the window, because Aldrich had not replaced it on his head after the assembly, had simply left it on the stand where he put it at night, and that choice said something she was only beginning to understand how to read. His scarred hand was warm against her palm. The new skin on her right hand, The blood-stained wrapping, long since discarded, caught the firelight and looked ordinary, which was all she had ever asked of it. The hall was dark below. Senna had taken to sleeping in the healer's outer room since the assembly, close enough to be present and far enough to be discreet, a courtesy she extended without being asked, because that was the quality that had made her Jasper's friend in the first place. She was seen now. Not seen the way a ward is catalogued, not seen the way the hall had seen her on the night of the dying moon, as a deficit, as a line item, as a thing to classify and dismiss. Seen the way a person is seen when someone has decided she is worth the trouble of looking clearly. She had not expected that. She had expected the keep, and the work, and the cold, and perhaps eventually a quiet and unremarkable tenure as a healer in the lower districts with enough distance from Draven's reach to live without constant management. She had not built a hope that looked like this. His hand moved slightly on hers, a small adjustment, nothing more than settling. She let her fingers fold against his.